The wind swept through the wooden streets of the small frontier town, carrying with it the faint chime of the chapel bell and the dust of another restless afternoon. Folks moved slow that day, whispers trailing through the saloon doors and over the porch rails of the general store. Something strange was happening in town, something that had every pair of eyes turned toward the little white church by the edge of the cottonwoods. A man was standing there, a tall rancher with calloused hands and a quiet temper, waiting in his worn hat and clean shirt like he'd been cornered by fate itself. He wasn't one for crowds or ceremonies, and he sure wasn't the kind of man who'd be seen standing at an altar, but desperate times could twist even the proudest souls. And that's when she appeared, the woman who had offered to be his fake bride. She wasn't from this town. Her dress was too plain for city folk, yet too fine for a ranch hand's daughter. Her boots carried the mud of travel, and her eyes, steady, guarded, said she had nowhere else to go. She'd come on the noon stage, stepped down without a word, and agreed to something that wasn't supposed to mean a thing. A simple exchange, that's what the deal was. The rancher needed a wife, on paper at least, to keep the bank from taking his land after his brother's death. She needed a roof, food, and safety from whatever past chased her across the desert. Nothing more. No love, no promises, just a piece of paper and a short ceremony to fool the law. But when the chapel doors opened and sunlight struck her face, the quiet murmur of the crowd fell still. He had never seen anyone look so calm, and yet so breakable. She moved like someone used to being watched but not understood. Every step she took toward that altar carried a story the town didn't know, and a secret she'd sworn not to tell. The preacher's hands trembled as he unfolded the worn Bible, his voice barely louder than the creak of the pews. The rancher looked at her once, long enough to notice her trembling hands and the way her lips pressed tight like she was holding back 1,000 thoughts. He wasn't sure if she pitied him or feared him, maybe both. Either way, they were about to stand side by side and lie to an entire town. The folks in the back whispered that the rancher had lost his mind. Some said she was a widow. Others claimed she'd run away from a gambler in Tucson. But no one really knew her name, not the way he'd come to know it that morning when she wrote it down on the marriage license with a hand that barely stopped shaking. It was a name that sounded borrowed from another life. And when she looked at him after signing, something unspoken passed between them. A quiet understanding that neither of them wanted to be here, but both needed to survive. The preacher began the vows, his voice catching on the dust in the air. Each word felt heavy, too real for what they'd agreed upon. The rancher answered when he had to, his jaw tightening every time the word wife was spoken. She kept her eyes on the floorboards, her voice soft but steady. Outside, the wind had died. The town held its breath. Even the horses tied by the hitching post seemed to sense something was different about this union. And then came the moment, the part that neither of them had planned for. The kiss, it was supposed to be nothing, just a gesture, a polite act to seal the lie. But when he leaned down and his lips met hers, the world didn't stay still the way lies usually do. Her hand brushed against his chest by accident, or maybe on purpose. He couldn't tell, and the air between them turned heavy and sharp. It wasn't the kind of kiss that could be explained away to the crowd watching. It felt too real, too sudden, like something deep inside both of them recognized what the other had been running from. For a moment the room fell away. The whispers, the preacher, even the bell outside. There was only the sound of his heartbeat and the taste of her breath trembling between them. When they stepped apart, her face had gone pale, her eyes wide as if she'd just crossed a line she didn't mean to. The rancher's hand hovered near hers, uncertain whether to let go or hold on. The preacher closed his book slowly, his expression unreadable, and the townsfolk began to murmur again. It was done. They were man and wife, though nothing about it felt false anymore. The deal had turned into something neither of them expected, and that terrified them both. After the ceremony, the rancher tipped his hat stiffly and walked her outside, where the sunlight burned against the horizon. He could hear the laughter from the saloon drifting down the street, and the faint sound of a fiddle somewhere in the distance. He'd lived through storms, droughts, and loss, but this woman, standing beside him in silence, was something else entirely. He'd promised her safety, not affection, but the way she looked at him, like she didn't know whether to thank him or run, unsettled the ground beneath his boots. As they made their way toward the waiting wagon, he noticed how her eyes darted toward the edge of town, where the dirt road disappeared into the canyon. She was hiding something, he could feel it, and though he told himself not to care, he couldn't shake the thought that whatever secret she carried was about to change everything. He offered her a hand to help her climb onto the wagon seat, and for a second she hesitated, as if taking his hand meant more than just a ride to the ranch. Then she placed her fingers in his palm and something faint and electric passed between them again. They rode in silence. The ranch stretched wide under the falling sun. Miles of fences, barns, and cattle spread across the dusty hills. It wasn't much, but it was all he had left of his brother. He'd promised to keep it running, and marrying her was supposed to make that possible. Yet as they approached the wooden gate, he wondered if the cost would be more than land or pride. She sat beside him, her gaze lost somewhere between the dying light and the horizon, as if she was saying goodbye to something no one else could see. When they reached the house, a lonely structure of pine and stone, the rancher jumped down first and helped her off the wagon. The evening air was cold, brushing against the fields like a whisper. Inside, the lamp burned weakly, its glow stretching across the worn floorboards and a single framed photograph on the mantel. It showed his brother and a woman holding a child, ghosts of a life that ended too soon. She stared at the picture for a long moment before turning toward him. There was a question in her eyes he couldn't read, something caught between pity and fear. He poured water into a tin cup and offered it to her, watching as her fingers brushed his again. "You can stay here," he said quietly. "No one in town will question it now." She nodded, but there was hesitation in her voice when she spoke. "And when they do?" she asked. He didn't answer, because he knew they would. Secrets had a way of crawling into daylight in places like this. Outside, the coyotes began to howl in the distance. The sound echoed through the valley, and for a moment she looked toward the window like she was listening for something else. Something familiar, something dangerous. He noticed the way her shoulders stiffened, the way her hand reached for the small leather pouch tied to her waist. He thought it might hold a letter or money, but when she caught him looking, she quickly turned away. Night fell over the ranch like a veil. The moonlight touched her face as she stood by the doorway, her expression unreadable. Somewhere deep inside, both of them knew that this marriage, this lie, wasn't going to stay simple. The kiss had changed everything. It had woken something real in a place built on pretending. And though neither dared to speak it, they both felt it. The start of something neither could stop, even if they tried. And as the wind carried the last sound of the coyotes across the plains, she whispered something so quiet he almost missed it. "They'll come looking for me." He froze, the words sinking deep into the night, and suddenly, the world outside that little house didn't feel so still anymore. The words she whispered hung heavy in the room, as if the walls themselves had paused to listen. "They'll come looking for me." The rancher didn't move. His hand, still holding the lantern, trembled just slightly, casting wild shadows against the wooden walls. Outside, the coyotes howled again, this time closer, their cries rising like a warning from the dark hills beyond. The woman stood by the door, her face half hidden in the dim light, her eyes fixed on the open land stretching into the night. He wanted to ask who they were, but something in her silence stopped him. She didn't owe him answers. They barely knew each other, bound only by an agreement that had already gone further than either of them planned. But now her words had changed everything. The rancher finally set the lantern down, the flame flickering between them. "You'll be safe here," he said, though he wasn't sure he believed it. "Nobody comes out this far without a reason." She turned slowly to face him. "They'll find one," she murmured. The next morning, the ranch came alive with the sounds of work. The roosters crowed, the horses snorted in the corral, and the scent of hay drifted through the dry wind. The woman moved quietly about the kitchen, her sleeves rolled to the elbows as she poured coffee into 2 tin mugs. She didn't ask for instructions. She just worked like she'd done it all her life. The rancher watched from the doorway, trying not to stare too long, yet finding it hard to look away. She had changed the rhythm of the house in less than a day. He remembered how empty it had felt before she came. Days running together. The silence after his brother's death lingering like dust that never settled. He'd worked the land out of duty, not purpose. But now there was something different. Her presence filled the quiet in a way that made him uneasy. Not because she spoke much, she didn't, but because when she did, every word felt like it carried the weight of something she was trying not to say. Around noon, as they worked near the barn, a rider appeared on the ridge. The rancher squinted against the sun, his hand resting on the fence rail. The figure paused for a long moment, watching the ranch before turning his horse back toward the valley. The woman froze, her hand tightening around the pail she carried. "You know him?" the rancher asked. She shook her head too quickly, eyes darting to the ground. "No," she said, "just someone passing through." But he wasn't convinced. Out here, men didn't just pass through. Every mile of land had a reason behind it. He didn't press her, though. He knew what it meant to run from something. He'd done his share of running, too. That evening, when the sky turned red over the hills, he saw her sitting by the corral, staring at the horizon like she was waiting for it to swallow her whole. The wind tugged at her hair, and the faint glimmer of tears caught the last light of the day. He almost walked away, but something held him there. "You can tell me," he said finally, his voice low and steady. "Whatever it is." She looked up, startled, then shook her head. "You wouldn't believe me." He leaned against the fence, eyes fixed on the darkening sky. "Try me." For a long time she didn't answer. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "I was promised to a man I never wanted to marry. He owned land, money, people. I ran before the wedding, took what little I had and never looked back." Her words came slowly, like each one cost her a breath. "He sent men after me, said I stole from him, said he'd drag me back if it was the last thing he did." The rancher's jaw tightened. "And you think that's who's coming?" She nodded. "He doesn't forgive." Silence stretched between them. The rancher looked out over his land, every fence post and ridge suddenly feeling smaller, less certain. He'd built this place to keep the world out, but now it seemed the world was coming for it anyway. "If he shows up," he said, "he'll have to go through me first." She gave a faint, tired smile. "You don't know what kind of man he is." "No," he replied. "But I know the kind of man I am." That night, sleep didn't come easy. He sat by the fire long after she'd gone to bed, staring into the flames while the wind pressed against the windows. Her words kept circling in his head, stirring up something he thought he'd buried years ago. Loss, anger, duty, they all felt tangled now. He wasn't sure why he cared so much about a stranger, but there was something in her eyes, something broken yet fierce, that reminded him of everything he'd once tried to protect. In the middle of the night, he heard movement outside. The boards creaked, and the horses shifted nervously in the corral. He grabbed his rifle and stepped onto the porch, scanning the darkness. The moonlight caught the shape of a figure moving along the fence line, but when he called out, the figure vanished into the shadows. The woman appeared behind him, barefoot and pale in her nightdress. "Did you see it too?" she whispered. He nodded. "Someone's been watching." By dawn, there were fresh tracks by the barn, hoofprints that didn't belong to any of their horses. Whoever had come had stopped close enough to see the windows, maybe even to listen. The rancher followed the trail a ways out past the creek, but it disappeared into the rocks. When he came back, she was waiting by the porch, her face drawn but calm. "He's found me," she said quietly. "It's only a matter of time." For the next few days, the rancher doubled the chores, keeping himself busy fixing fences and moving cattle closer to the main field. The work gave him something to hold on to, something solid while the uncertainty grew heavier. The woman helped where she could, carrying water, tending the chickens, mending clothes, but he could see the fear behind her quiet gestures. Every time a bird startled or a wagon creaked in the distance, she'd flinch ever so slightly. Then one afternoon, as the sun sank low, they heard the sound of hooves again, this time from the road leading straight to the ranch. A group of riders approached, their horses kicking up clouds of dust. The rancher's hand went to his rifle, his eyes narrowing as the men slowed near the gate. The lead rider was dressed too fine for a cowhand, dark coat, polished boots, hat pulled low. Even from a distance, he carried himself like someone used to being obeyed. The woman's breath caught in her throat. "That's him," she whispered. "Don't let him see me." She stepped back toward the house, her hands trembling. The rancher met the men halfway down the drive. "Can I help you?" he called. The leader tipped his hat, revealing sharp eyes that studied every inch of the ranch before landing on him. "We're looking for someone," he said smoothly. "A woman. Been traveling under a false name. Heard she came this way." The rancher's jaw hardened. "Ain't seen anyone like that," the man smiled coldly. "That's so, funny thing. Folks in town said you got yourself married just a few days ago." The rancher didn't answer. His grip tightened around the rifle. "My wife's inside, and she ain't the woman you're after." The stranger's smile widened, but his eyes turned mean. "We'll see about that." He turned his horse slightly, giving a small nod to the men behind him. They lingered for a moment before pulling back toward the trail, dust swirling around their hooves. "Tell your wife I'll be back," the man said, tipping his hat again. "And tell her running don't change what's owed." When they were gone, the rancher stood there a long time, watching the dust settle. The woman stepped out from the shadows of the porch, her eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. "You shouldn't have lied for me," she said. "Now they'll come for you too." He looked at her, the faint light of the sunset catching in his tired eyes. "Then let them," he said. "This land's seen worse than men like him." But even as he said it, the unease in his chest deepened. Because in that moment he realized something he hadn't before. Whatever she was running from wasn't just about the man. It was bigger, older, and far from over. And as the last of the daylight faded from the hills, he knew that by taking her hand at the altar, he hadn't just saved her. He'd bound his life to the storm that was still coming. The night after the riders came was long and sleepless. The woman lay in the small room at the end of the hall, her eyes open to the faint glow of moonlight creeping across the wooden floor. Every sound outside made her heart skip, a shifting horse, the wind against the shutters, the restless hum of crickets in the grass. She could still see the face of the man who had led the riders, his voice smooth, his words sharp. The same voice that used to echo through her nightmares. She had run far, crossed rivers and deserts to escape him, but now it felt like the world had folded in on itself, bringing him right to her door again. In the next room, the rancher sat by the window, his rifle across his knees. He hadn't taken off his boots, hadn't even tried to sleep. He'd lived through droughts and raids and heartbreak, but this felt different. It wasn't just his land he was protecting now. The thought unsettled him. He told himself he was doing this out of decency, that no woman should face danger alone. But deep down, he knew it was more than that. Something about her silence, her bravery under fear. It reached a place in him he'd thought had gone cold years ago. By morning, the air felt tense and still. He rode into town to see if anyone had spoken to the strangers. The streets were quiet, dust swirling between the storefronts. The saloon keeper, polishing glasses behind the counter, glanced up as he walked in. "Those men you're asking about?" he said. "They came through last week. Didn't stay long, paid cash. Said they were tracking a thief." The rancher frowned. "What kind of thief?" The man shrugged. "Didn't say. Just left this behind." He slid a crumpled poster across the bar. The rancher's stomach tightened as he smoothed it open. The sketch was crude, but the face was hers. Below it in faded ink were the words, "Wanted for theft and fraud. Reward $500. He folded the paper slowly, his mind racing. When he returned home, she was in the barn feeding the horses, her hands gentle but distant. He held out the poster without a word. She froze, her face draining of color. "Where'd you get that?" she whispered. "Town," he said. "You want to tell me what part of this is true?" She looked away, her voice trembling. "It's not what it says. I didn't steal money. I took something else. Something that belonged to my family before he took it from us." Her hands trembled as she spoke, clutching the hem of her dress. "It's a deed to land that once belonged to my father. He signed it away under threat, and when that man tried to destroy it, I took it back. He wants it because it proves he's been lying for years." The rancher said nothing for a long while. He had seen men do worse things for less. "Where is it now?" he asked. She hesitated, then reached for the leather pouch she always wore around her waist. "Here," she said softly. "It's all I have left." That night rain rolled in from the west. Thunder cracked above the hills, shaking the windows of the old ranch house. They sat by the fire, the storm howling outside, the flames flickering over the tension between them. "You should have told me," he said. She stared into the fire. "Would you have let me stay if I did?" He didn't answer. He didn't need to. She knew what the look in his eyes meant. Trust was a fragile thing out here, and once broken, it was slow to mend. The storm passed by dawn, but it left behind a trail of silence. The ground was soaked, the air thick with the scent of wet earth. They went about their chores without speaking much. Every glance between them felt heavy, uncertain. But the rancher couldn't shake the thought of those men returning. He knew their kind, men who wouldn't stop until they got what they came for. 2 days later, he got his first sign that they hadn't gone far. Near the creek, he found fresh boot prints in the mud, leading toward the back of the property. Whoever it was had been watching the house again. He followed the trail up the hill but stopped when he saw smoke rising in the distance. Too faint for a campfire, too steady for a traveler. Someone was camped nearby. When he returned to the house, she was sitting by the window, staring toward the same ridge. "They're waiting," she said quietly. "He's not a man who lets go. He'll wait until we're tired, until we make a mistake." Her voice was calm, but there was a sadness in it, as if she'd already seen how this story ends. The days that followed were filled with uneasy routine. They worked side by side, fixing fences, hauling water, pretending the world hadn't closed in around them. But every evening, when the sun dipped behind the hills, they both found themselves glancing toward that ridge, half expecting to see riders silhouetted against the dying light. The tension grew like a weight pressing on their chests. One afternoon, an old neighbor named Dillard rode by. He was a talkative man, friendly but sharp-eyed. Over coffee on the porch, he leaned forward and said, "Heard some trouble brewing in these parts. Folks saying a gang's been asking about your wife." The rancher forced a calm tone. "People talk too much," Dillard grinned. "Maybe so, but if I were you, I'd keep an eye on that road." After the neighbor left, the woman stepped out from behind the door, pale and quiet. "They'll come through him next," she said. "He's a gossip. Word will spread faster than the wind," the rancher sighed. "Then we prepare." They began reinforcing the barn doors, boarding up the windows, making sure the rifles were cleaned and loaded. The work gave them something to focus on besides fear. But with each passing day, the weight of what might come pressed harder on both of them. In the evenings, they sat on the porch, watching the sky turn from gold to ash, saying little but thinking the same thing, in quieter moments. He learned more about her, how she grew up near Prescott, how her father had lost everything after the railroad came through, how she'd once dreamed of teaching before the world turned cruel. She learned about him too, how he'd lost his brother in a horse accident, how the ranch had been his whole world since then, how loneliness had become his only companion until she showed up. Their stories were different, but their pain was the same, shaped by loss and the will to keep going. Still, the closer they grew, the heavier the fear became. The rancher knew that if the man chasing her came back, it wouldn't be just about land or papers anymore. It would be about pride, and pride was a dangerous thing in men like that. One evening, as they sat by the fire, she took out the folded deed and laid it on the table. "It's not just paper," she said softly. "It's proof that my family existed, that we mattered once." He looked at it, then at her. "And he'd kill to take it from you." She nodded. "He already has." The words hit him hard. He realized she wasn't just running from a man, she was running from a graveyard of everything she'd loved. He reached across the table, his rough hand brushing hers, not as a promise but as a quiet offering. "Then he won't take anything more," he said. Outside, the night deepened. The crickets fell silent, the horses restless in their stalls. Somewhere beyond the creek, a twig snapped. The rancher's head lifted instantly. He crossed to the window, rifle in hand, eyes scanning the darkness. Another sound, a low whistle, the kind men use to signal in the dark. He turned toward her. "Get down," he whispered. Through the faint light, he could see shadows moving near the barn. 3, maybe 4. One of them carried a lantern. They were closer than he'd thought. He motioned for her to stay low as he slipped out the back door, the cold air biting against his skin. The night was thick and quiet except for the faint crunch of boots on wet grass. He crept along the side of the house, the barrel of his rifle glinting under the moonlight. The figures moved toward the barn doors, whispering to each other. He recognized one voice, the same man from before, the smooth one with the polished boots. "She's here," he was saying. "The papers too? Take the horses, we'll burn the rest." The rancher's jaw tightened. He raised the rifle, heart pounding. He didn't pull the trigger yet. Not until he had to. Not until there was no turning back. Inside the house, she stood by the window, clutching the pouch at her waist, watching the man who'd once owned her future step into her present again. The wind rose, carrying dust across the fields. The barn door creaked open, and the sound echoed through the valley like a warning. The rancher took a slow breath, the weight of everything, fear, duty, and something like love, settling in his chest. And as the leader stepped into the doorway, the rancher finally spoke into the night. "You made a mistake coming here." The man turned toward the voice, smiling in the dark. "No," he said softly. "I came to take back what's mine." The words hung there, sharp and certain, as the storm that had been building between them at last began to break, quiet, dangerous, and inevitable. The man's voice carried through the night like the whisper of a snake before it strikes. "I came to take back what's mine," he said, his tone calm but heavy with threat. The rancher stood in the shadows, his rifle steady though his hands were trembling with something deeper than fear. Behind the barn wall, he could hear the woman's faint breathing from the house, quick and uneven, as if she knew this night was the one she'd been running from all along. The moonlight was pale, slicing through the clouds in thin silver lines. It caught the edge of the stranger's gun as he motioned to his men. "Spread out," he ordered. If she runs, don't shoot her. Bring her back alive. The rancher's heart thudded hard against his ribs. He didn't want bloodshed on his land, but the moment he saw the lantern light flash against their rifles, he knew there was no avoiding it. He stepped from the shadows, his boots sinking into the damp ground. "You're trespassing," he said evenly. The men froze, their eyes darting toward the sound. The leader turned, that same cold smile crossing his face. "Ah, the husband," he said mockingly. "You've got yourself in the middle of something you don't understand, friend. Hand her over, and maybe I'll let you keep your land." The rancher didn't move. The rain-soaked wind tugged at his coat, carrying the scent of horses and gunpowder. "She's my wife," he said quietly. "And she's under my protection." The leader laughed, low and cruel. "Protection?" he echoed. "You don't even know who she is. Do you, rancher? She's a thief, a liar, a woman who ruins every man foolish enough to care for her. She stole from me, ran from me, and now you're just another fool caught in her trap." The rancher's jaw tightened. "You talk too much," he said, and raised the rifle. The man's smile faded. For a heartbeat, the only sound was the wind. Then chaos erupted. One of the strangers fired first, a muzzle flash lighting up the night like lightning. The rancher dove behind the trough, the bullet tearing through the post beside him. He fired back, the shot echoing across the valley. Horses screamed, men shouted, and the air filled with the acrid sting of smoke. Inside the house, the woman grabbed the pouch and crouched by the window, her hands shaking. Every sound from outside cut through her like a blade, the gunfire, the shouting, the crash of glass breaking near the barn. She wanted to run out there to stop it, but she knew she couldn't. He was out there because of her, and if she stepped outside, it would all be for nothing. The rancher moved fast, circling behind the barn. Two of the men were trying to flank him, their boots sinking into the mud. He waited until one stepped into the open, then struck him with the butt of his rifle, sending him sprawling. The other lunged, and they crashed into the wall, fists and elbows flying. The rancher's hat fell, his cheek splitting open from a wild swing, but he fought like a man who had nothing left to lose. The leader stayed back, watching with that same cold amusement. "You can't win this," he called out. "You're one man against four. Don't throw your life away for a woman who'll leave you the first chance she gets." The rancher ignored him, dragging himself up from the mud. His shoulder ached from the recoil, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He had fought before, against droughts, against death, against the kind of loneliness that eats at a man until he forgets what hope feels like. But this was different. This wasn't just survival. This was choice. The woman couldn't stand it any longer. She slipped out the back door, clutching the pouch close. The night swallowed her instantly, the cold biting through her thin dress. She ran toward the barn, the ground slick beneath her boots. When she reached the corner, she saw him, her husband, battered and breathless, standing between her and the men who had once owned her fate. "Go back inside," he shouted when he saw her, his voice raw. But she shook her head, tears streaking down her face. "I won't let them kill you." The leader stepped forward, pistol drawn. "How touching," he sneered. "Both of you, out here in the mud, pretending you've got something worth dying for." He cocked the hammer, the metallic click slicing through the rain. "Give me the deed and I'll let him live." The woman reached into her pouch, her hand trembling. The rancher's eyes widened. "Don't," he whispered. But she was already holding the paper out, her fingers shaking. "Take it," she said, her voice breaking. "Just leave him alone." The leader smiled, lowering his gun slightly as he stepped closer. "Wise choice," he said. But before his hand could touch the paper, the rancher swung the rifle up, the barrel aimed straight at his chest. "You'll have to go through me," he said, his voice calm and steady despite the blood dripping from his lip. The men around them raised their weapons again, and the air tightened with the weight of what was coming. The woman stood frozen between them, the paper fluttering in her hand like a dying bird. "Please," she whispered. "No more." The leader's smile vanished. "You really think this ends here?" he said coldly. "You're not just fighting me. You're fighting everything that belongs to me. My men, my law, my money. You think you can change that with a gun and a lie?" The rancher said nothing, but his silence was an answer in itself. He believed in nothing but the truth he could see. And right now, that truth was standing beside him, terrified but unbroken. Lightning flashed across the sky, throwing their faces into sharp relief. For a moment, time seemed to stop. Then a single shot cracked through the night. The horses bolted, screaming as thunder rolled overhead. The woman gasped, spinning toward the sound. Someone had fired, but who? The leader stumbled back, clutching his shoulder, rage twisting across his face. "You'll pay for that," he snarled. His men fired wildly, bullets sparking against the barn and tearing through the fence. The rancher grabbed the woman's arm, pulling her down behind the trough as wood splintered around them. "Run!" he shouted. "Get to the creek! Go!" She hesitated for a heartbeat, her eyes wide with terror. "What about you?" "I'll be right behind you," he said, though they both knew it might not be true. She turned and ran, clutching the pouch to her chest as rain poured down again, blurring the world into streaks of light and shadow. Behind her, gunfire echoed through the night, each shot tearing through the air like a heartbeat that wouldn't stop. At the creek, she stumbled and fell, the cold water biting her skin. She crawled toward the rocks, gasping for breath, her heart hammering so loud she could barely hear the rain anymore. She looked back once, the ranch a blur of firelight and chaos in the distance. She couldn't see him. Only flashes of light, only the sound of shouting and horses screaming in the dark. Back at the ranch, the leader, bleeding but furious, called out into the storm. "You can't hide her forever," he shouted. "When the sun rises, this place will burn." His men were scattering, one already limping toward the horses, another lying still near the barn. The rancher stood in the doorway now, his shirt torn, his rifle slick with rain. His breathing was ragged, his eyes locked on the man who had brought war to his doorstep. The two faced each other in the storm, thunder rumbling low above them, the rain washing blood into the dirt. "You should have stayed gone," the leader said. "Men like you don't win." The rancher's voice came quiet but firm. "Maybe not," he said. "But men like you don't get to keep taking." The leader raised his pistol. The rancher leveled his rifle. For a moment the world held its breath. Then lightning tore across the sky, blinding white. The echo of thunder drowned everything else. Down by the creek, the woman flinched at the sound, her hands gripping the cold rock. She wanted to run back to find him, but her legs wouldn't move. The rain came harder, and through the noise she thought she heard one last gunshot, sharper, closer than the rest. Then silence, the kind of silence that feels alive, heavy with everything left unsaid. She waited, her breath coming in broken gasps, her fingers clutching the soaked pouch. The world around her seemed to fade, the storm, the fear, even the night itself, until only one thought remained in her mind. She couldn't lose him. Not after everything he'd done. Not after that kiss that was never supposed to mean anything but had changed everything. Somewhere in the distance, a lantern light flickered again, faint but moving closer. She turned toward it, her heart aching with both hope and dread. Was it him? Or was it the man who'd sworn he'd come back for her? The storm hadn't ended. It had only just begun. The rain had slowed by the time the woman gathered the courage to move from the creek bed. The thunder was distant now, rumbling like an old memory fading into silence. Her dress clung to her skin, heavy and cold, but she hardly noticed. She was listening, for footsteps, for a voice, for anything that would tell her who had survived that final shot. The lantern light she had seen flickered again, swaying in the wind. She rose slowly, her body trembling from exhaustion and fear, and began to walk toward it. Every step sank deep into the mud, and every breath hurt as though the air itself had turned sharp. When she reached the ridge overlooking the ranch, the sight stopped her cold. Smoke curled from the barn, but the house still stood. The ground was scattered with broken wood, footprints and shadows of what had happened. The fire's glow threw long shapes across the field, and for a terrible moment she thought she saw him lying there among the wreckage. She nearly called out, but the sound caught in her throat. Then through the haze she saw him. The rancher. He was standing near the porch, his body stiff, his arm pressed against his side. He looked like a man carved from the storm itself, tired, wounded, but alive. She ran to him, slipping on the wet earth, calling his name though it came out barely above a whisper. When she reached him, she saw the blood on his sleeve, but his eyes, those steady, worn eyes, were clear and watching her as if seeing her for the first time all over again. "You're safe," he said softly, though his voice was rough from smoke and pain. "I told you I'd be right behind you." She reached for him, her hands trembling as she pressed against the wound. "You shouldn't have stayed," she said. "You could have been killed." He gave a faint, tired smile. Would have been worse letting him win. Behind them, the rain hissed against the embers of the fire. The other men were gone, either scattered into the dark or lying still where they fell. The leader was nowhere to be seen. She looked toward the edge of the property, where the trees grew thick near the creek, and for a second she thought she saw movement, a shape limping into the darkness, one hand clutching his arm. Then it was gone. Maybe he had escaped. Maybe the land would take care of him in its own way. The rancher didn't chase. He only said, If he's smart, he won't come back. They sat on the porch when the dawn came, the light pale and quiet over the valley. The storm had washed everything clean, leaving the air fresh and the earth dark and shining. Birds returned to the trees as if the world had been waiting for them to start singing again. She handed him a clean cloth to wrap around his arm. He winced but said nothing. She could see how tired he was, the weight of what he had done settling over him like the rain-soaked sky. After a while he looked at her, his voice low. "You could leave now if you wanted," he said.
"The road's clear."
"No one would blame you." She stared at him, surprised. "Leave?"
she repeated.
"After everything?" He nodded. "You don't owe me anything." She looked down at the pouch in her lap, the one she had guarded through every mile of her running. Slowly she opened it. The deed was still inside, damp but intact. She smoothed it out on the step between them, the paper trembling in the soft wind. "This is all that's left of my past," she said. "But it's not where I belong anymore." She lifted her gaze to him. "I'd rather stay where I'm not running." For a long moment neither of them spoke. The quiet was deep and full, not empty like it used to be. Finally he said, "If you stay, it won't be easy. The ranch barely holds together as it is." She smiled faintly. "Neither do I." That simple truth broke something open between them, something that didn't need words or promises. He nodded once, as though her choice settled something that had been weighing on both their hearts. In the weeks that followed, life slowly returned to the land. The barn was rebuilt with rough-hewn timber from the nearby hills, the fences mended, the animals calmed. The townsfolk whispered about the gunfight that had lit up the valley that night, but most didn't ask too many questions. Folks out there understood that some stories were better left between the people who lived them. The woman worked alongside the rancher every day. She learned how to milk the cows, how to stack hay, how to ride across the range at sunrise when the mist still clung to the grass. At night she cooked simple meals, and they ate in comfortable silence, sometimes talking about little things, the weather, the harvest, the sound of coyotes in the distance. It wasn't the kind of life either of them had imagined, but it was theirs, and that was enough. One evening, as summer settled into the valley, a rider came down the road, a mail carrier from Prescott. He brought a letter sealed with an official stamp. The woman took it with cautious hands, her heart sinking as she recognized the signature on the back. It was from the lawyer who had once worked for the man she'd fled. The letter said the deed was valid. The land her father had owned was legally hers again. The man who chased her had been charged with fraud in another county. He wouldn't be coming back. She read the letter twice before passing it to the rancher. He nodded slowly, relief mixed with something quieter, something heavier. "So it's over," he said. She folded the paper and slipped it back into her pouch. "Yes," she said, "but I don't think I want the land anymore." He raised an eyebrow. "Why not?" She smiled softly. "Because what I was fighting for, I've already found." That night they stood by the corral, watching the stars come out one by one. The air was warm and still, the kind of night that made the world feel wide again. The rancher leaned against the fence, his sleeve rolled up, the faint scar on his arm catching the moonlight. She stood beside him, her shoulder brushing his. "Funny how things end," he said. "Wasn't supposed to be real, remember? Just a paper marriage." She looked at him, her eyes gentle. "Maybe the best things start as something pretend," she said. He chuckled quietly. "And what do we do now, Mrs. Whatever you choose to be?" She smiled. "We live. That's all I ever wanted." The crickets sang in the tall grass, and somewhere out in the dark an owl called from the trees. The land, scarred but alive, stretched wide under the endless western sky. It wasn't a place of peace, not really. It was a place of hard work and heartbreak, of dust and forgiveness. But it was also a place where two people who had been broken by different worlds had somehow found a reason to stay. As the night deepened, he turned to her and said, "The preacher'll think we're fools if we tell him how it started." She laughed softly. "Maybe," she said, "but he'll see how it ended." The next morning the sun rose golden over the hills, spilling light across the valley. The ranch looked small under the wide sky, but it felt like the center of something vast and quiet. She stood by the porch, watching the rancher saddle a horse. The wind lifted her hair, warm and gentle this time. He looked up at her and smiled. "Ride with me?" he asked. She hesitated for only a moment, then nodded. He helped her onto the saddle, and together they rode out across the open land. The earth smelled of new grass and rain, and the sky ahead was clear. There were no riders chasing her now, no past waiting to claim her. Only the road, the morning and the steady rhythm of hooves carrying them forward. By midday, they stopped at the edge of the ridge where the creek ran below. The same place where she'd once hidden in fear, the same place where the story had nearly ended. She looked down at the water and smiled faintly.
"It feels different now," she said. He nodded.
"It's not running anymore," he said. "Just moving forward." She turned to him, her hand brushing his. And for a long moment they just looked at each other, the woman who had once been hunted, and the man who had once stopped believing in anything worth saving. The air between them felt light again, free of all the shadows that had followed them there. When they rode back to the ranch, the sun was setting behind them, the sky painted in gold and rose. The wind carried the faint sound of the church bell from town, a reminder of the day that had started everything. The kiss at the altar, the one that was never supposed to mean a thing, had changed their fates in ways neither could have imagined. And as the last light faded over the land, she glanced at him and said softly, "Guess some lies end up truer than the truth." He smiled at her, that quiet, knowing smile of a man who'd finally found peace. "Yeah," he said. "And sometimes, a fake bride becomes the only real thing a man ever needed." The wind swept across the valley, carrying their laughter into the coming night, as the ranch stood strong beneath the wide western sky, proof that even in a world of dust and storms, love could still take root where no one expected it to.